Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to another chilling tale from Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy spine-tingling stories that linger long after the lights go out, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring more bedtime horrors to life. Now settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for tonight's true story. Abandoned Asylum Screams at Night. It was the autumn of 2009, just weeks before Halloween, when the wind began to carry whispers through the skeletal trees surrounding the old Blackwood Asylum in rural West Virginia. The asylum had stood empty for over 40 years, its crumbling brick walls veiled in ivy, its shattered windows like hollow eyes staring into the void. Locals avoided the place not out of mere superstition, but because of what they claimed to hear on still, moonless nights: distant, guttural screams that seemed to rise from deep within the earth itself. On the evening of October 27, 2009, a young man named Theron Vale, a graduate student in forensic anthropology from Marshall University, arrived at the asylum's rusted iron gates with a backpack, a digital recorder, and a curiosity that outweighed his caution. Theron wasn't chasing ghosts, he was chasing history. His thesis focused on forgotten psychiatric institutions and the ethical failures that led to their closures. Blackwood, once known as the Blackwood State Hospital for the Incurably Insane, had been shut down abruptly in 1973 following a series of unexplained patient deaths and staff disappearances. Official records were sealed. Survivors refused to speak. The air that night was thick with the scent of damp leaves and decaying wood. A pale mist curled around Theron's boots as he stepped past the gate, its hinges groaning like a warning. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing graffiti-scarred hallways and overturned gurneys frozen in time. The silence was oppressive, so complete that the crunch of his own footsteps echoed like gunshots. He set up his recorder in what appeared to be the old electrotherapy room. Wires dangled from the ceiling like dead vines. A metal chair, still bolted to the floor, bore deep scratches along its armrests, as if someone had fought desperately to escape. Theron pressed record and spoke softly into the device. October 27, 2009. 9:43 p.m. Location: Blackwood Asylum, Ward C. Ambient temperature approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit. No visible signs of recent human activity, though I can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Only the occasional creak of settling timber, the skittering of unseen rodents in the walls. Theron began to doubt the rumors. Maybe the screams were just wind through broken pipes, or the collective imagination of a town steeped in folklore. Then, at precisely 11:17 p.m., it began. A low moan, human yet distorted, rose from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. It wasn't loud, but it carried an unnatural resonance, as if echoing through water. Theron froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound stretched into a wail, then fractured into overlapping voices. A woman sobbing, a man shouting incoherently, children crying in unison. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to surround him, pressing in from every shadowed corner of the room. His recorder captured it all. The temperature plummeted. Frost bloomed across the metal chair. Theron's fingers grew numb, though he hadn't removed his gloves. He tried to speak, to ask who was there, but his voice failed him. The wailing intensified, now punctuated by sharp, rhythmic banging, like fists hammering against steel doors. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed shut with such force that dust rained from the ceiling. Then silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Theron didn't move for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally gathered the courage to check his recorder, the playback revealed something even more disturbing. Beneath the screams, almost inaudible, was a whisper, repeating the same phrase over and over in a voice that sounded both ancient and childlike. "They never let us leave, they never let us leave." He fled the asylum that night, not stopping until he reached his car, parked half a mile down the overgrown access road. He didn't look back. In the weeks that followed, Theron attempted to analyze the audio with colleagues, but every attempt to isolate the whisper resulted in corrupted files or equipment failure. One technician claimed the voice pattern didn't match any known human vocal range. Another refused to touch the recording after hearing it once, saying it gave her nightmares for days. Theron never returned to Blackwood. But he did uncover a buried detail in county archives. In 1968, a fire broke out in Ward C during a routine lockdown. 7 patients and 2 orderlies died. The official report listed the cause as electrical malfunction, but a handwritten note in the margin, unsigned, read, "Patients were locked in. Screamed until the smoke took them." To this day, residents of the nearby town of Elkhorn report hearing screams on quiet October nights, especially around the 27th. Some say the wind carries the voices of those who never escaped. Others claim the asylum isn't truly abandoned, that something remains inside, waiting, listening, and remembering. Theron Vale now teaches at a small college in Oregon. He no longer studies asylums. And he never records audio after dark. If you ever find yourself near Blackwood Asylum on a still autumn night, listen closely. But whatever you do, don't answer. Months passed after Theron Vale's harrowing night at Blackwood Asylum, yet the echoes of that evening clung to him like damp fog. He tried to bury himself in lectures, grading papers, and weekend hikes through the Cascade foothills, but sleep remained elusive. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it again. The layered screams, the metallic clang of unseen doors, and that whisper, soft yet insistent, "They never let us leave." By the spring of 2010, Theron had nearly convinced himself it was trauma playing tricks on his mind. That was until a package arrived at his university mailbox with no return address. Inside was a yellowed manila envelope, brittle at the edges, sealed with a wax stamp bearing the initials BSH, Blackwood State Hospital. His hands trembled as he opened it. The contents were sparse but chilling. A patient intake form dated October 25, 1968, listing a name he had never seen in any official record, Corwin Meyer. Age 34. Diagnosis: acute auditory hallucinations with violent ideation. But what unsettled Theron most was the handwritten note scrawled in the margin in a different ink. Subject insists the walls speak. Claims the building is alive. Refuses treatment. Says he can hear the others, even the dead ones. Beneath the form lay a faded photograph. It showed a gaunt man with sunken eyes standing in what appeared to be Ward C, the very room Theron had recorded in. Corwin Meyer's gaze was fixed not at the camera, but slightly above it, as if staring at something on the ceiling. And behind him, barely visible in the shadowed corner, was a shape, indistinct, blurred, but undeniably human in outline. Theron spent days cross-referencing archives, calling retired state employees, even visiting the West Virginia Department of Health. No one had heard of Corwin Meyer. His name appeared in no death certificates, no census records, no obituaries. It was as if he had never existed, except for that single document, delivered to Theron as though summoned by memory itself. Then, on a rain-slicked evening in late May, Theron received an email from an unexpected source. Dr. Lysander Croft, a former Blackwood psychiatrist who had retired in 1975 and lived quietly in Charleston. The message was brief but urgent. "I saw your name attached to a Freedom of Information request regarding Blackwood. If you're still interested in the truth, real truth, not the sanitized version, meet me at the old Elkhorn Diner this Saturday at 7 p.m. Come alone. And for God's sake, don't bring a recorder." Theron didn't hesitate. The diner was nearly empty when he arrived, its neon sign flickering like a dying pulse. In a corner booth sat an elderly man with thin white hair and hands that shook slightly as he stirred his coffee. Dr. Croft looked up as Theron approached, his eyes sharp despite their age. "You're the boy who went inside," Croft said, not as a question but a statement. "Foolish. Brave but foolish. Theron Saturday, I need to understand what happened there." Croft exhaled slowly, his breath carrying the scent of peppermint and old tobacco. Blackwood wasn't just poorly run. It was infected. Not with disease but with something older. The land it was built on, Elkhorn Ridge, was once a burial ground for a pre-colonial tribe. They called it the place where voices gather. When the state broke ground in 1922, workers reported hearing singing at night. Some quit. Others vanished. He paused, glancing toward the window as if expecting to see something in the rain. By the 50s, staff began reporting patients speaking in tongues they'd never learned. By the 60s, orderlies refused night shifts. Then came the fire in Ward C. Officially, 9 died. Unofficially, 23. The extra 14 were never logged. They were problem patients, the kind no one would miss. Locked in during a drill that turned real. No alarms sounded. No help came until morning. Theron's throat tightened. Corwin Meyer, was he one of them? Croft's face darkened. Meyer wasn't a patient. He was a janitor. Quiet man. Listened more than he spoke. But in the weeks before the fire, he started writing on the walls, symbols no one recognized. Said the building was hungry. The administration had him committed to shut him up. Put him in Ward C as a disciplinary measure. He died in the fire? No, Croft whispered. He walked out, barefoot, covered in soot, eyes wide open but unseeing. He made it to the gate, then collapsed. When they turned him over, his mouth was sewn shut with copper wire. No one knew how. The autopsy was sealed before the body cooled. Theron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Why tell me this now? Because you heard them, Croft said, leaning forward. And if you heard them, they've heard you too. The drive back to Oregon was a blur. Theron kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing in the road. That night, for the first time since Blackwood, he dreamt clearly. He was back in Ward C, but the room was pristine. White tiles, gleaming instruments, the hum of fluorescent lights. A man in a stained orderly's uniform stood by the metal chair, holding a spool of copper wire. He turned. It was Corwin Meyer. His lips were stitched shut, yet he spoke, voice echoing as if from a deep well. You listened. Now you belong. Theron woke gasping, his sheets soaked in sweat. On his nightstand, his phone displayed a notification. A new voicemail from an unknown number. He played it. Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of distant screams, and beneath them the whisper, "They never let us leave." The next morning, Theron discovered something on his front porch. A small, rusted key tied with black thread. It matched no lock in his house. But when he held it to the light, he saw tiny engraving along the shaft. Ward C. He didn't call the police. He didn't throw it away. Instead, he packed a bag. Because deep down, he knew the truth. Blackwood wasn't done with him. And perhaps, he wasn't done with Blackwood. 3 weeks later, on the eve of the autumn equinox, Theron Vale returned to West Virginia. This time he brought more than a recorder. He carried notebooks filled with symbols copied from Croft's hidden journals, a vial of salt blessed by a Navajo elder he'd tracked down in Arizona, and a resolve hardened by dread. The asylum looked worse than before. Vines now choked the entrance, and one of the upper windows had collapsed inward, like a missing tooth. But the air was different. Charged. Expectant. As he stepped across the threshold, the wind died. Not a leaf stirred. Even the crickets fell silent. Then, from deep within the building, a single clear note rang out, like a piano key struck in an empty concert hall. Theron took a breath, tightened his grip on the salt vial, and walked forward. Behind him, the front door creaked shut on its own. And this time, it locked. The silence that followed the click of the lock was not empty, it was watchful. Theron stood motionless in the foyer, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Dust motes hung suspended in the beam of his flashlight, as if time itself had paused to observe his next move. He reached for the doorknob, but it refused to turn. Not jammed, refused. The metal felt unnaturally cold, almost alive beneath his fingers. He exhaled slowly, forcing calm into his limbs. "You wanted me back," he murmured, more to himself than to the unseen presence. "Fine. But I'm not here to listen anymore. I'm here to understand." With that, he turned away from the door and advanced deeper into the asylum. The hallway stretched before him, longer than he remembered. The walls, once cracked and mildewed, now bore strange markings, faint chalk-like symbols that hadn't been there before. They pulsed faintly in the periphery of his vision, vanishing when he looked directly at them. He recognized some from Dr. Croft's journals, protective sigils used by the indigenous people of Elkhorn Ridge, meant to bind restless spirits, or contain something worse. His boots echoed too loudly on the linoleum, each step reverberating as if the floor were hollow. Beneath it he thought he heard breathing. Ward C lay at the end of the east corridor. As he approached, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of ozone and burned hair. His flashlight flickered. He tapped it once, then it died completely. Darkness swallowed him whole. But only for a moment. A dim, greenish glow began to emanate from beneath the door of Ward C. Not electric. Not fire. Something older. Theron pushed the door open. The room was transformed. Gone were the rusted chair and dangling wires. In their place stood a circle of scorched floor tiles, arranged in a perfect ring. At its center lay the rusted key he'd found on his porch, now resting atop a child's leather shoe blackened by fire. The walls were covered in writing, not graffiti but meticulous script, looping and angular in languages Theron couldn't place. Yet somehow he understood fragments. The stone remembers, the walls drink sorrow, 9 voices, 1 hunger. Then a sound. Not a scream this time. A lullaby. Soft, off-key, sung by a woman's voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was a tune Theron had never heard, yet it tugged at memories he didn't possess. Of rocking chairs, of cold hands tucking blankets, of whispered promises broken before dawn. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. The singing stopped. Pause. Then a whisper, not from one direction but from the walls themselves, the floor, the very air. "We are the ones who stayed." Theron swallowed. "Why?" "Because we were told to." The voice shifted, now a man's, now a child's, now something that wasn't human at all. "They said if we were quiet, if we didn't fight, they'd let us go. But the doors never opened. The fire came, and still they locked us in." A cold draft coiled around Theron's ankles. He looked down. The scorched circle on the floor began to glow faintly, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. "You're not ghosts," he realized aloud. "You're echoes. Trapped in the moment of your worst fear." "Yes," the voices sighed in unison. "And you listened. That made you adore." Theron's blood ran cold. What does that mean? When someone hears us clearly, truly hears, not just with ears but with soul, they become a bridge. A way out. But the building, it doesn't want us to leave. It feeds on our pain. Our silence. Our screams. As if on cue, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost spread across the walls in jagged fractals. The lullaby began again, but distorted now, slowed, warped, turning into a dirge. "The key wasn't a gift," the voices whispered. "It was an invitation. You brought it back. That means you chose to return. And now, you must choose again. What choice? Stay, or take our place?" Theron staggered back. "No. There has to be another way." "There is," came the reply. "But it requires sacrifice. Not of life, but of memory. If you wish to free us, you must carry our pain into the world. Every scream, every tear, every moment of terror. You must remember for us, so we can forget." Silence settled once more, thick and expectant. Theron thought of his quiet life in Oregon, the lectures, the coffee shops, the illusion of normalcy. He thought of sleepless nights haunted by sounds no one else could hear. But he also thought of Corwin Meyer, mouth sewn shut, walking out of hell only to die on the threshold of freedom. He thought of the 14 unrecorded souls, erased from history like stains on a ledger. He looked at the scorched circle, at the child's shoe, at the key. Then he stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the boundary, the room erupted in light, not blinding but golden, warm, like sunrise after a long night. The walls trembled. The writing flared brightly, then faded as if burned away. The lullaby returned, pure and clear this time, sung in harmony by many voices, no longer broken but at peace. One by one the whispers ceased. The frost melted. The green glow dimmed. And Theron felt them leave. Not as ghosts but as memories, flowing into him like rain into dry earth. He saw flashes, a nurse hiding a child under a cot during the fire, an orderly trying to break down a locked door with his bare hands, Corwin Meyer tracing symbols on the wall with his own blood, hoping to build a cage strong enough to hold the hunger in the stones. When it was over, he collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face, not from fear but from the unbearable weight of compassion. The asylum was silent, truly silent. He stood, picked up the key and walked to the door. It opened easily. Outside, the first light of dawn touched the treetops. Birds began to sing. Theron Vale never returned to academia. Instead, he moved to a small cabin near Elkhorn where he began writing, not a thesis but a book. He called it The Voices of Blackwood. In it, he named every soul he could confirm. The 9 officially recorded, the 14 hidden, and Corwin Meyer, the janitor who tried to warn them all. The book was never published. Publishers called it too disturbing, unverifiable, unmarketable. But Theron didn't care. He left copies in libraries, mailed them to historians, read passages aloud at local gatherings. He became known as the man who spoke for the forgotten. Years later, on a crisp October evening in 2023, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night at the ruins of Blackwood Asylum. They brought cameras, flashlights, and bravado. But when they stepped inside, they found something unexpected. Tucked into the rusted remains of the electrotherapy chair was a leather-bound journal. On the first page, in neat handwriting, it read, "If you hear screaming, don't run. Listen. Then tell someone. Because silence is how they stay trapped." The teens left quickly that night, but not before one of them took the journal home. And somewhere, in a cabin lit by candlelight, Theron Vale smiled faintly, hearing the distant sound of a new voice joining the chorus, not in fear but in remembrance. For as long as someone remembers, the lost are never truly gone. And as long as someone listens, the screams can finally become stories. Years passed, and the legend of Blackwood Asylum evolved, not into something forgotten but into something honored. The journal left behind by Theron became a quiet catalyst. Copies surfaced in university folklore departments, in paranormal research circles, even in local school history projects. What was once a cautionary tale of horror slowly transformed into a memorial woven from truth, grief, and reluctant grace. Theron, now in his late 40s, rarely spoke of that final night inside Ward C. But he never stopped listening. He'd sit on his porch at dusk, eyes closed, not in fear but in vigilance, tuning his ears to the wind, to the rustle of leaves, to the distant hum of the earth. He claimed the land itself had grown quieter, as if finally allowed to rest. Yet peace, as he had learned, is never absolute. In the spring of 2025, a letter arrived, not by email, not by courier, but hand-delivered by a young woman with storm-gray eyes and a satchel stitched with protective charms. She introduced herself only as Marin, a descendant of the Elkhorn Ridge tribe whose ancestors had once warned against building on the burial grounds. She carried with her a bundle wrapped in deerskin. "My grandmother dreamed of you," she said, her voice low but steady. "She said the stone is stirring again." Theron's blood ran cold, though he showed no sign. The asylum was demolished last year. There's nothing left but rubble. Marin unwrapped the bundle. Inside lay a smooth, obsidian-black stone, no larger than a palm, etched with the same symbols Theron had seen on Blackwood's walls. "The building is gone," she replied. "But the hunger wasn't in the bricks. It was in the ground. And it remembers you." She explained that during the demolition, workers had unearthed a sealed chamber beneath the foundation of Ward C, something not on any blueprint. Inside they found scorched bones, copper wire, and hundreds of small stones like the one she now held. Each bore a name. Most were unreadable, weathered by time and fire. But one was clear: Corwin Meyer. The construction crew, unnerved, had filled the chamber back in and poured concrete over it. But within weeks, 3 of them reported nightmares of being locked in a room with no doors, hearing voices begging to be remembered. One man disappeared entirely, his truck found abandoned on the ridge, engine still running, radio tuned to static. "The land is grieving," Marin said, "and it's reaching for the only one who ever listened." Theron knew then that his role was not over. He agreed to return, not to the ruins but to the sacred council of Marin's people, held deep in the forest where the ridge met the river. There, under a sky thick with stars, elders shared stories passed down through generations. They spoke of a being they called the Keeper of Echoes, Not a demon, not a ghost, but a manifestation of collective suffering given form by the land itself. It did not seek to harm. It sought to be witnessed. But witnessing, they warned, came at a cost. "The keeper binds to those who carry its truth," said the eldest, a woman named Nokos, her face lined with wisdom and sorrow. "You freed the voices, Theron Vale. But you did not free the silence between them. That silence, it has weight. And it is calling you home." That night, Theron dreamed again. But this time he stood not in Ward C, but in a vast, empty field beneath a blood-red moon. Before him stretched a line of figures, men, women, children, each holding a stone like the one Marin had brought. They did not speak. They simply waited. At the end of the line stood Corwin Meyer, his stitched mouth now healed, his eyes clear. He held out his hand. In it rested a final stone, blank, waiting to be named. Theron woke with tears on his cheeks and a certainty in his bones. He spent the next month preparing. Not with salt or symbols, but with words. He recorded every name he could verify. He transcribed every fragment of testimony, every archived note, every whispered rumor. He compiled them into a single scroll, bound in ashwood and sealed with beeswax. On the night of October 27th, 16 years to the day since his first visit, he returned to the site of Blackwood Asylum. The concrete pad was cracked, weeds pushing through like fingers reaching for the sky. Marin stood beside him, holding a small clay bowl filled with sacred herbs. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes," Theron replied. "I do." He unrolled the scroll and began to read aloud, each name, each story, each truth spoken clearly into the night. As he did, the wind stilled. The stars dimmed. And from the cracks in the concrete, a soft, golden light began to rise. One by one, the names on the stones beneath the earth flared with warmth. When he reached the last name, Corwin Meyer, the ground trembled gently, not in anger but in gratitude. The obsidian stone in Marin's hand grew warm, then crumbled to dust, carried away on a breeze that smelled of rain and wild mint. Then silence. Not the heavy silence of entrapment, but the peaceful quiet of release. Theron sank to his knees, exhausted but unburdened. For the first time in 16 years, he heard nothing in the wind but the rustle of leaves. Marin placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's done." But Theron shook his head. "No, it's just beginning." He knew now that remembrance was not a single act, but a practice. A promise. As long as someone spoke the names, the keeper would sleep. As long as someone honored the pain, the land would heal. In the months that followed, Theron worked with Marin and the tribal council to establish a memorial grove on the ridge. A circle of native trees, each planted over a reclaimed stone, each bearing a small plaque with a name and a date. Visitors came not for thrills, but for reflection. They left offerings, poems, pressed flowers, handwritten letters of apology to those history had erased. Theron never called himself a hero. He was simply a witness who chose to stay. And on quiet October nights, when the mist curls around the trees and the wind carries the faintest echo of a lullaby, those who listen closely might hear not screams, but thanks. For in the end, the greatest act of courage was not facing the dark, but ensuring the light remembered those who never saw it again. The memorial grove flourished over the next 2 years, its young trees growing taller with each passing season. Visitors came from across the country, not ghost hunters with night vision cameras, but historians, therapists, descendants of former patients, and even a few retired nurses who had once worked in institutions like Blackwood. They came to grieve, to learn, and sometimes, simply to sit in silence among the names. Theron Vale became the quiet steward of the grove. He lived in a modest cabin just beyond the tree line, where he maintained meticulous records of every visitor, every offering left at the base of the trees, every story shared under the open sky. He never charged admission. He never gave interviews. But if someone approached with genuine sorrow in their eyes and respect in their voice, he would offer them tea, a chair by the fire, and if they asked the truth, carefully, gently, without embellishment. It was on a damp afternoon in early March of 2027 that a man in a worn postal uniform arrived at the grove's edge, holding a water-stained envelope. He handed it to Theron without a word, then walked away as if relieved of a heavy burden. The envelope bore no return address, only a faded postmark from a town in upstate New York, population under 500. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, covered in neat cursive. Began. To whoever still listens. My name is Elias Rourke. I was an orderly at Blackwood from 1969 to 1972. I never spoke of what I saw because I was afraid no one would believe me, or worse that they would. On the night of the fire, I was supposed to be off duty. But I came back because I'd left my jacket in the staff room. That's how I saw them, the administrators, locking the doors of Ward C from the outside. Not during a drill. Not by accident. On purpose. They said the patients were too volatile, that containment was necessary. I tried to stop them. One of them pulled a gun. I ran. I've carried that shame for over 50 years. I never reported it. I changed my name. Moved 3 times. But the screams followed me into my dreams. If this letter finds its way to someone who knows the truth, tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I remember their names even if I was too cowardly to say them aloud back then. Elias. Theron read the letter twice, his hand steady but his heart heavy. He showed it to Marin the next morning. She studied it in silence, then placed a hand over his. This changes nothing, she said, but it adds weight to the truth. And truth, when shared, becomes lighter for everyone. With Elias's permission, granted in a follow-up letter, he included the confession in a new section of the memorial, a stone bench inscribed with the words, "Even silence has a voice." Beside it, a small bronze plaque bore Elias's name, not as a perpetrator, but as a witness who finally chose to speak. Weeks later, an elderly man arrived at the grove, leaning on a cane, his eyes scanning the trees with trembling urgency. It was Elias himself. He had driven over 800 miles to stand where the asylum once stood. Theron met him at the gate. No words were needed. They simply embraced. A man who ran and a man who stayed, united by the same burden now shared. Elias spent 3 days at the grove. He sat beneath the tree marked Corwin Meyer and wept. He placed a single white rose at the base of the bench bearing his own name. On his final evening he joined Theron by the fire. "I thought coming here would bring me peace," Elias said, staring into the flames. "But all I feel is regret." "Regret isn't the opposite of peace," Theron replied. "It's the doorway to it. You came. You spoke. That's how the dead forgive the living." Elias nodded, tears glistening in the firelight. He left the next morning, but not before planting a sapling of his own, a sugar maple, near the eastern edge of the grove. He carved no name into its marker. Only a single word, remember. As spring turned to summer, the grove continued to grow, not just in size but in purpose. Local schools began organizing field trips, not as morbid tourism, but as lessons in ethics, mental health history, and the consequences of institutional silence. A non-profit formed, funded by anonymous donors, to preserve the site and expand its archives. Theron, though reluctant at first, agreed to serve as its historical advisor. But the land, as Marin had warned, was never truly finished with him. One evening in late September, as golden hour painted the grove in amber light, Theron noticed something unusual. At the base of Corwin Meyer's tree, the soil had shifted. Not disturbed by animals, but deliberately. He knelt and brushed away the leaves. There, half buried, was a small tin box, rusted but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound notebook. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded, but legible. It belonged to Corwin Meyer. Not as a janitor. Not as a patient. But as a keeper of secrets. The journal detailed his time at Blackwood. Not just his observations of cruelty, but his growing awareness of something deeper. He wrote of dreams in which the asylum spoke to him in a language of roots and stone. He described rituals he performed in secret, using symbols passed down from his grandmother, who had been part of the displaced Elkhorn Ridge community. He believed the building had become a vessel, not haunted by ghosts, but by the land's own grief, amplified by human suffering. His final entry, dated October 26, 1968, the night before the fire, read, Theron sat there for a long time, the journal resting in his lap like a sacred text. He finally understood. Corwin hadn't been trying to escape. He had been trying to create a bridge, using his own life as the anchor. That night, Theron gathered the grove's caretakers, Marin, a few local volunteers, and even Elias, who had returned for the autumn equinox. By moonlight, they read Corwin's words aloud together, each voice adding to the chorus. As they spoke, a gentle wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of wood smoke and sage. And for the first time, Theron felt not the weight of memory but its wings. In the years that followed, the story of Blackwood ceased to be one of horror. It became a testament to resilience, to the power of naming the unnamed, and to the quiet heroism of those who choose to bear witness. Theron never wrote another book. He didn't need to. The grove itself became the story, living, breathing, growing. He grew older, his hair silvered by time, his steps slower, but his purpose never wavered. On his 70th birthday, surrounded by friends, students, and the rustling trees that bore the names of the lost, he placed a final stone at the center of the grove. It bore no name. Only a single phrase, carved in both English and the language of the Elkhorn people. We are still here because you listened. And on the quietest nights, when the world seems too loud or too cruel, those who walk the path through the memorial grove sometimes pause, and swear they hear not screams but a whisper on the wind, soft, grateful, and finally at peace. The years flowed like the river that curled around the base of Elkhorn Ridge, steady and sure, carving memory into the land. Theron Vale entered his 8th decade not as a recluse haunted by the past, but as a quiet elder whose presence alone seemed to calm the wind. The grove, now known formally as the Blackwood Remembrance Circle, had become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking not thrills but healing. Therapists brought clients struggling with inherited trauma. Veterans sat beneath the sugar maple planted by Elias Rourke, finding solace in shared silence. Schoolchildren left drawings of trees with smiling faces, each labeled with a name they'd learned in history class. Corwin, Lillian, Mateo, Juniper, and so many others once lost to bureaucracy and indifference. Theron rarely gave speeches, but on the anniversary of the fire, October 27th, he would stand at the center stone and read aloud from Corwin Meyer's journal. His voice, though weathered by time, carried with it a resonance that made even the birds fall still. People came from as far as California and Maine just to hear those words spoken under the autumn sky, as if the act itself kept the bridge between worlds intact. But in the spring of 2031, Theron began to fade. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the way old trees do, slowly shedding leaves, their roots still deep, their presence still felt even as their branches grow bare. He tired more easily. His hands, once steady enough to transcribe fragile documents, now trembled slightly when holding a teacup. Marin, now a respected cultural historian in her own right, noticed first. She moved into the cabin's spare room, not as a caretaker but as family. "You don't have to stay here forever," she told him one evening as they watched fireflies blink above the grove. "The work is done, Theron. The voices are heard. You can rest." He smiled, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the lantern on the porch. "Rest isn't the end of listening, Marin. It's just a different kind of attention." Still, he knew his time was shifting. And so, with the same quiet determination that had carried him through Ward C all those years ago, he began to prepare. He called together a small council: Marin, Elias, now in his late 90s but sharp as ever, a young archivist named Cale from the State Historical Society, and Noko's granddaughter, Wren, who had taken up her grandmother's role as keeper of oral traditions. Over 3 days they gathered in the cabin, surrounded by boxes of letters, recordings, soil samples, and pressed wildflowers left by visitors. Theron handed over the archives, not as a burden but as a trust. "The grove doesn't need me to speak for it anymore," he said. "It speaks for itself. But someone must tend the silence between the words. That's your work now." Cale, wide-eyed and reverent, accepted the digital backups and physical documents with both hands, as if holding sacred relics. Wren promised to continue the seasonal ceremonies, planting, naming, storytelling, in the old ways. Elias, tears in his eyes, placed a hand on Theron's shoulder and whispered, You gave us all a second chance to be human. Theron's final act was not grand but deeply personal. On the morning of October 27, 2031, the 53rd anniversary of the fire, he walked alone into the grove at dawn. He wore his oldest coat, the one with the patched elbows, and carried a small satchel. At the base of Corwin Meyer's tree, he knelt and dug a shallow hole. Into it, he placed his original digital recorder, the one that had captured the screams all those years ago, along with a folded letter addressed simply to the ones who stayed. Then he sat back on his heels, closed his eyes, and listened. The wind moved through the branches like a sigh. A woodpecker tapped rhythmically in the distance. Somewhere, a child laughed. Visitors had begun arriving early for the day's ceremony. And beneath it all, Theron heard something new. Not voices, not whispers, but a deep, quiet hum, the sound of peace settling into the earth. He returned to the cabin that afternoon and never left his bed again. He passed 3 nights later, just before midnight, with Marin holding his hand and the window open to the grove. There was no storm, no eerie silence, no supernatural sign. Only the gentle slowing of breath and then stillness. His funeral was held not in a church, but beneath the great oak at the grove's heart. Over 200 people came, descendants of patients, former students, strangers who had read his letters online and felt changed by them. No eulogy was given. Instead, each person stepped forward and spoke one name from the memorial. One by one, the lost were called back into the light, not as ghosts but as honored ancestors. Afterward, in accordance with his wishes, Theron's ashes were mixed with soil from the original asylum foundation and used to nourish a new sapling, a black walnut, chosen for its strength and longevity. At its base, a simple stone was placed. It bore no dates, no titles. Only 2 words. Thank you. Years turned. The grove expanded. A small museum opened nearby, funded by a grant from a national mental health advocacy group. It displayed artifacts not to sensationalize suffering, but to educate. Patient letters, medical tools from the era, audio stations where visitors could hear Theron's calm narration of historical context. School groups came weekly. Researchers cited the Blackwood Remembrance Project in papers about ethical memory and restorative justice. And every October 27th at precisely 11:17 p.m., the time the screams were first recorded, the grove falls into a voluntary silence. For exactly 9 minutes and 23 seconds, the number of officially recorded victims. No one speaks. No phones ring. No footsteps crunch on gravel. The community simply stands together, listening to the wind, honoring the space between sound and silence. Some say that if you stand very still during those minutes, you can feel a warmth rise from the earth, not frightening but comforting, like a hand on your shoulder. Others claim the trees seem to lean in as if sharing a secret. Most just feel a quiet sense of being witnessed, of belonging to something larger than themselves. The legend of the abandoned asylum that screamed at night is still told, but now it ends differently. It ends not with terror but with tenderness. Not with escape but with return. Not with forgetting but with remembrance that heals. And though Theron Vale is gone, his legacy lives in every name spoken aloud, every seed planted, every person who chooses to listen when the world urges them to look away. For in the end, the most powerful exorcism is not banishment, but belonging. And the deepest peace is not the absence of pain, but the presence of compassion. So if you ever find yourself near Elkhorn Ridge on a quiet autumn evening, walk the path through the trees. Place your hand on a trunk. Say a name. And know that somewhere, in the rustle of leaves or the sigh of the wind, someone is saying yours in return. Decades later, long after the last of Theron's contemporaries had passed into memory, the Blackwood Remembrance Circle had become more than a memorial. It had become a living philosophy. Nestled in the rolling hills of West Virginia, it drew not only mourners and scholars, but seekers of a different kind. Those who believed that places could heal, that silence could speak, and that truth, when tended like a garden, could bloom even from scorched earth. By the year 2052, the grove spanned over 12 acres. New saplings were planted each spring during the ceremony of names, a tradition now broadcast live to classrooms and community centers across the country. The original black walnut tree, Theron's final resting place, stood at the center, its branches wide and strong, its roots interwoven with those of Corwin Meyer's sugar maple and Elias Rourke's oak. Children called it the listening tree, and it was said that if you pressed your ear to its bark on a windless night, you could hear a soft, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat shared between earth and sky. The stewardship of the grove had passed through careful hands. After Marin, it was Wren who guided its evolution, blending ancestral wisdom with modern archival science. Then came Cale's daughter, Leora, who pioneered a digital memory project that allowed visitors to scan QR codes at each tree and hear recorded stories, some from Theron's original tapes, others from descendants who had only recently discovered their family's connection to Blackwood. No story was too small. A nurse's apology. A brother's letter never sent. A child's drawing found in a sealed drawer. All were honored. But the true test of the grove's purpose came not from within, but from without. In 2048, a powerful development firm proposed building a luxury wellness resort on the adjacent ridge, complete with spa villas, a golf course, and a haunted history-themed lounge that promised thrills inspired by real asylum legends. The announcement sparked outrage among locals, but legal protections for the grove itself were thin. It was not a national landmark. It had no federal funding. It existed solely on donated land and communal care. For the first time in decades, fear returned to Elkhorn. But this time it was met not with silence, but with unity. Leora, now in her 40s and serving as the grove's lead archivist, organized a campaign unlike any before. She didn't just appeal to emotion, she built a case rooted in historical justice, environmental ethics, and mental health advocacy. She partnered with universities, tribal councils, and survivor-led organizations. She unearthed declassified state documents proving the deliberate cover-up of the Ward C fire. She compiled testimonies from over 300 families whose ancestors had been erased from institutional records. And then she did something unexpected. She invited the developers to the grove. Not to protest, not to shame, but to listen. On a misty morning in early April, the CEO of the firm, a woman named Dara Chin, known for her ruthless efficiency, arrived in a sleek electric vehicle, flanked by 2 assistants and a legal advisor. She expected a confrontation. Instead, she was met by Leora, who offered her a cup of mint tea and a simple request: walk with me. Say nothing. Just listen. For 2 hours they moved slowly through the trees. Leora spoke only when asked, sharing stories not of horror but of humanity. She showed Dara the bench where Elias had wept. She pointed to the stone where Theron had buried his recorder. She read aloud a passage from Corwin's journal about the land's grief. At the listening tree, Dara paused. She placed her hand on the bark, and for reasons she could not explain, tears filled her eyes. I lost my brother to a psychiatric facility, she whispered, voice breaking. They called it treatment. But he never came back the same. And when he died, they wouldn't even give us his records. Leora said nothing. She simply nodded. 2 weeks later, the development plan was withdrawn. In its place, Dara Chin announced the creation of the Elkhorn Healing Trust, a non-profit dedicated to funding mental health services, historical preservation, and land-based trauma recovery programs. She donated $10 million to expand the grove's educational outreach and build a quiet retreat center for survivors and caregivers, designed not for luxury but for reflection. The grove had not just defended itself. It had transformed an adversary into an ally. As the years flowed on, the world changed in ways no one could have predicted. Wars flared and faded. Technologies rose and collapsed. Climate shifts altered the very soil of the ridge. Yet the grove endured, not as a relic but as a refuge. By the late 21st century, it had inspired similar sites across the globe. The Asylum Garden in Ontario, the Ward 7 Memorial in Oregon, the Silent Circle in Ireland. Each adapted Theron's core principle, that remembering is an act of love, and that the dead deserve not just names but dignity. And still, every October 27th at 11:17 p.m., the ritual continued. People gathered, some in person, others via hololink from distant continents. They stood in silence for 9 minutes and 23 seconds. Children held hands with elders. Strangers exchanged quiet nods. And in that shared stillness, something profound happened. The past was not relived as trauma, but honored as teacher. No one screamed anymore, but everyone listened. In the year 2083, on the 115th anniversary of the Blackwood Fire, a young girl named Cora, great-great-granddaughter of Corwin Meyer, stood at the center of the grove during the ceremony of names. She was 12 years old, with her ancestors' sharp eyes and quiet intensity. In her hands she held a new journal, its pages blank except for the first entry. Today I planted a tree for the ones who will come after me. I don't know their names yet, but I promise to listen for them just like Theron listened for us. As she pressed the sapling into the earth, a breeze swept through the grove, rustling every leaf at once, a sound like 1,000 whispers, soft and sure. And somewhere deep in the roots of the listening tree, the earth sighed in gratitude. For the circle was not closed. It was continuing. And as long as someone chose to remember with kindness, to listen without fear, and to plant seeds in the shadow of sorrow, the screams would never return. Only the stories, only the names, only the quiet, enduring truth that even the darkest places can become sacred if someone is brave enough to stay, and gentle enough to care. Time, as it always does, kept moving, carrying the grove forward not through grand upheavals, but through the quiet persistence of daily care. By the year 2097, the Blackwood Remembrance Circle had evolved into something its earliest guardians could scarcely have imagined. A global model for ethical remembrance, woven into the fabric of how societies confront institutional trauma. Universities offered courses in compassionate archiving, using Theron Vale's journals and Corwin Meyer's symbols as foundational texts. Mental health professionals trained at the Elkhorn Retreat Center, learning to treat not just symptoms, but the historical wounds that often underlie them. Yet for all its reach, the grove remained profoundly local. The soil was still tended by hand. The names were still spoken aloud by neighbors. And every spring, children from the Elkhorn Elementary School walked the path with small trowels and saplings, learning that memory is not passive. It is something you plant, water, and protect. It was during one such planting day in early May of 2098 that a discovery was made, one that would deepen the grove's purpose once more. Young Mateo Ruiz, aged 10 and named after a patient whose name had been recovered from a water-damaged intake log, was digging near the eastern boundary when his trowel struck something hard. Not a rock. Not a root. Metal. He called over his teacher, who in turn summoned Leora's granddaughter, Elara, now the grove's lead historian at just 29. Carefully, they unearthed a small, rusted lockbox, its surface etched with the same angular symbols Corwin had used in his journal. Inside, wrapped in oilskin preserved by the dry clay soil, were dozens of fragile paper slips. Each bore a single name, a date, and a short phrase: loved roses, sang to the moon, afraid of thunder, wrote poems in the margins. These were not official records. They were acts of quiet rebellion. Further research revealed that a nurse named Helen Price, who had worked at Blackwood from 1965 to 1971, had secretly documented her patients not as cases, but as people. She'd hidden these notes in the walls, beneath floorboards, even sewn into the hems of uniforms, hoping someone someday might find them and remember the humans behind the diagnoses. The discovery sent ripples through the archival world. But more importantly, it changed how the grove honored its names. New markers were crafted, not just with birth and death dates, but with these tender fragments of identity. At the base of Lillian Cho's tree now bloomed a small ceramic rose. Beneath Mateo's namesake, a tiny bronze moon hung from a branch. For the man who feared thunder, a wind chime made of smooth river stones was installed, its soft clinking a gentle counterpoint to storms. The grove had always been about truth. Now it was also about tenderness. That same year, a new kind of visitor began to appear, not drawn by history but by hope. Families with loved ones currently in psychiatric care came to sit beneath the trees, seeking not answers, but reassurance that their stories mattered. Some left letters tucked into bark crevices: "We see you, we won't forget you, you are more than your diagnosis." Others simply sat in silence, drawing strength from the knowledge that healing is possible, even when it begins in broken places. Among these visitors was a woman named Dr. Amara Finch, a neurologist from Boston who had spent her career advocating for humane mental health reform. She came not as a professional but as a daughter. Her mother, now in her late 80s, had been institutionalized briefly in the 1980s after a postpartum breakdown, a time when such women were often labeled hysterical and discarded. Amara brought her mother to the grove on a crisp October morning. The older woman, frail but sharp-eyed, walked slowly along the path, her fingers trailing over the engraved names. When she reached the bench inscribed with Elias Rourke's confession, she stopped and wept, not from sorrow but from recognition. "They never asked me what I needed," she whispered. "They only asked what was wrong with me." Amara held her hand. "But here," she said, "they ask who you are." That visit changed Amara's life. She returned the following spring, not alone but with a team of medical students. She began hosting annual ethics and care workshops at the retreat center, using the grove as a living classroom. Her curriculum centered on a simple but radical idea, that listening is the first act of healing. Meanwhile, the land itself seemed to respond to the care it received. Ecologists noted that native plant species once thought extinct in the region had begun to reappear around the grove's edges: purple coneflowers, black cohosh, and ghost pipes, a pale flower that thrives in symbiosis with tree roots. Indigenous botanists called it a sign. The land was remembering its own balance. Even the weather patterns shifted subtly. Storms that once raged over Elkhorn Ridge now often broke just before reaching the grove, as if the clouds themselves paused in reverence. Locals joked that the listening tree had learned to calm the sky. But the most profound change was in how the story was told. No longer was it the asylum that screamed. It was the place that learned to listen. Children's books were written about Corwin the Keeper and Theron the Listener. A folk singer composed a ballad that played softly in the retreat center's common room. And every year, on the anniversary, a new ritual was added. Visitors were invited to write a hope, not for the past but for the future, and tie it to the branches of the listening tree with biodegradable thread. By spring, rain and wind would carry the messages into the earth, completing the cycle. In the winter of 2099, Hilara received a package from a remote village in Norway. Inside was a smooth river stone and a note written in careful English. "Our asylum closed in 1970. We built a garden too. Thank you for showing us how." The grove was no longer alone. It had become a seed. And seeds, by their nature, are meant to travel. As the century turned, the world faced new crises: climate displacement, digital alienation, the erosion of communal memory. Yet in the face of these, the grove stood as a quiet testament to what is possible when people choose empathy over fear, remembrance over erasure, and presence over escape. On the morning of January 1st, 3001, Hilara stood alone in the grove at sunrise. Snow dusted the branches like powdered sugar. The air was so still she could hear her own breath. She placed a new stone at the base of Theron's tree, a piece of black walnut wood polished smooth with a single word burned into its surface: "Continue." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and frozen earth. Somewhere a cardinal sang. And deep below, in the roots that held the ashes of the past and the seeds of the future, the land hummed its quiet, enduring song. For the work was never finished. It was only passed on. And as long as someone walked the path with open eyes and a willing heart, the circle would hold. Not as a monument to what was lost, but as a promise to what could still be found. Dignity in memory, peace in truth, and above all, the courage to listen, even when the world screams for you to look away. But peace, as Theron once whispered in his final journal entry, is never the end. It is only the silence before the next breath. For decades the grove flourished. The names were honored. The land seemed to heal. Visitors came and went, comforted by the rustling leaves and the gentle weight of remembrance. Yet deep beneath the roots of the listening tree, where Theron's ashes mingled with the soil of Ward C, something had not been laid to rest. It had been waiting. Not for vengeance. Not for chaos. But for forgetting. And in the year 3007, forgetting began. Attendance at the ceremony of names dwindled. The annual broadcast was canceled due to low engagement. The retreat center, once full of seekers, stood mostly empty, its halls echoing with the ghosts of conversations no longer had. Even the schoolchildren stopped coming, distracted by neural feeds and virtual histories that required no walking, no touching, no silence. The grove grew quiet in a new way, not peaceful but hollow. Elara, now in her late 80s, was the last true keeper. She still walked the path every dawn, still spoke each name aloud, still tied hopes to the branches. But her voice grew weaker and fewer answered. Then, on the night of October 27, 3007, the 139th anniversary of the fire, Elara did not return to her cabin. Search teams found her at the base of the listening tree, seated upright as if in meditation. Her eyes were open. Her hands rested gently in her lap. There were no signs of struggle. No illness. The coroner listed the cause as undetermined. But those who knew her swore her lips were slightly parted, as if she had been speaking when her breath stopped. The next morning the grove seemed different. The air was too still. The birds did not sing. And the wind, when it finally came, carried a sound no one had heard in over a century. Faint at first, then clearer. A whisper, not of gratitude, not of peace, but of hunger. Over the following weeks, strange reports surfaced. Visitors claimed their devices malfunctioned near the listening tree. Audio files corrupted, cameras captured only static, and voice memos played back distorted screams layered beneath their own recorded words. One teenager live-streamed from the grove and went silent mid-sentence. The feed cut to black, but audio continued for 17 seconds, just long enough to capture a chorus of voices whispering in unison, "You stopped listening, so now we must speak louder." Then came the dreams. People across Elkhorn began waking in the night, drenched in sweat, convinced they'd heard someone calling their name from the woods. Some claimed they saw figures standing among the trees, pale, indistinct, their mouths moving but no sound coming out. Others reported finding their front doors unlocked at dawn, with damp footprints leading inside and back out again. The final warning came from a groundskeeper who arrived early one foggy November morning. He found every name plaque in the grove turned backward, facing the trees, not the path. And carved into the bark of the listening tree, fresh and deep, were 3 words: "They are awake." The grove was closed indefinitely. Fences went up. Signs warned of unstable terrain. But locals knew better. They kept their curtains drawn after sunset. They avoided the ridge. And they never, ever spoke the names aloud anymore. Because silence, they realized too late, was not respect. It was an invitation. And somewhere beneath the soil, where copper wire still coils around old bones, where scorched floor tiles lie buried under concrete in time, the doors of Ward C have begun to rattle again. Not from the outside. From within. The asylum is gone. But the screams? The screams were never in the building. They were in the listening. And now, no one is left to hear them. Except you.